Hey guys, Wels Knight here, and welcome back to another episode of Magic the Gathering Arena. In today's video, I want to talk about a lot of the common terminology that you will encounter in MTG Arena. So I want to start off with the color combinations, and I'm going to kind of breeze through those, and then we'll get to a whole bunch of the other terms like mana curve and virtual card advantage and burn and blah blah blah. We'll get to all that stuff later. So first of all, let's talk about the color combinations. Now, I'm going to breeze through these very quick because odds are you're probably not going to remember them all. Essentially what you need to know is that there are a ton of different potential color combinations when creating a deck. We look at the decks that I've already created. We've got like white-black, we've got blue-black, we've got blue-black-red, we've got et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each of those different color combinations, for the most part, has some sort of name assigned to it, which is taken from the Magic the Gathering lore. So that's where the names come from. The names are a little bit wonky sometimes. You probably will not remember them all, but basically what you just need to know is that those names exist. They refer to certain color combinations, and they're taken from the lore. That's why they're something you might not recognize. So basically, we'll start with the two color combinations in alphabetical order. You've got Azorius, which is white and blue. You've got Boros, which is red-white. Dimir, blue-black. Golgari, black-green, Gruul, red-green, Izzet, blue-red, Orzhov, white-black, Rakdos, black-red, Selesnya, green-white, and Simic, which is green-blue. Again, you don't need to remember all of these right away. You will kind of learn them as you go, but the important thing is to just realize that they exist, and when someone says he's playing a Jeskai deck, you know that he's referring to a certain color. Or he's playing a Dimir deck. You know they're talking about a color. Like this one right here, Dimir Surveil. This deck is a Dimir deck because it's blue and black. Pretty straightforward. So now let's jump into the three color combinations. There's Abzan, which is white, black, green. Bant, green, white, blue. Esper, white, blue, black. Grixis, blue, black, red. Jeskai, blue, red, white. Jund, black, red, green. Mardu, red, white, black. Naya, red, green, white. Sultai, black, green, blue. And Temur, green, blue, red. Again, you don't got to remember all those. Just know that they exist. And that when someone says it's a insert name of group deck, they're talking about the color combinations. So now let's get into the more fun stuff, which is all the other terms. So first of all, you've got your three main types of decks, and that's aggro, control, and mid-range. So aggro decks are generally very fast, kind of aggressive decks that essentially aim to win by beating up your opponent as quickly as possible. Stuff like this mono red aggro. Lots of cheap creatures, lots of burn spells, and basically this deck aims to win by turn 4 or 5 or 6, aims to win very, very quickly before your opponent has a chance to kind of get set up and establish any sort of real board presence. Or generally this deck just doesn't win. This deck usually wins by like turn 6 or 7, or it just doesn't win at all. It's one or the other. Then you've got your control decks. Control decks essentially aim to prevent your opponent from doing stuff. They get rid of your opponent's creatures, they counter your opponent's spells, and they essentially aim to prevent your opponent from doing things until you draw into one of a very small number of actual powerful win conditions. So I don't know if I have a good example of a control deck here. Maybe this Dimir Surveil deck. I'm not even sure what's in here because this was built forever ago before I had my rare lands. But control decks will generally play stuff like counter spells, removal spells, things like that. Basically things to prevent your opponent from enacting their game plan while you wait to draw into something that's very, very powerful, such as a Doom Whisperer or something along those lines. Those are control decks. Then you have your mid-range decks, and mid-range decks are basically kind of somewhere in between aggro and control. They're not waiting on a very small number of very powerful monsters to win, but they're also not super, super aggressive and fast. They're kind of somewhere in between. They're often referred to as the jack of all trades, master of none sort of decks, and they often are very reliant on a sideboard in a best of 3 matchup to kind of bring in certain things that sort of help them out against certain matchups. They're very flexible, and they tend to be, you know, kind of somewhere in between the aggro and aggro and control. And there's also kind of a triangle, a rock, paper, scissors, if you will. Generally, aggro will beat control, control will beat mid-range, and mid-range will beat aggro. That's not always the case. There are exceptions, but some matchups are more favorable than others. So then we've got terminologies for different types of spells and decks. So burn. If you see someone playing a burn deck, that's going to be spells such as things like shock. Basically, burn is direct damage. It is damage that hits something with an actual number, deals 2 damage to any target, deals 3 damage to any target, deals 2 damage. These would all be examples of burn spells. Other burn spells would be... let's go here. No? Sovereign's Bite would be a burn spell. Target player loses 3 life. What would not be a burn spell are things that don't have a damage number associated with them. Stuff like Vraska's Contempt. This does kill something, but it doesn't deal a direct damage number. This would instead be a removal spell. And removal spells can be burn spells, but burn spells are not always removal. Or maybe I said that the other way, backwards. Either way, if it has a damage number associated with it and it's a targeted zappy thing, it's probably a burn spell. Next, you've got Stompy. Stompy is a terminology for a certain type of deck. Basically, it is big creatures that stomp all over face. That's a Stompy deck. So often it'll be mono green. Mono green Stompy will be what you'll often hear referred to. But basically, it deals with big creatures. Then you've got your tribal decks. Tribal decks are decks built around a certain type of creature. So if, for example, we look at vampires, you can see on all of these cards, they're going to say creature hyphen something something. So these are vampire soldiers. You've got vampire soldiers, vampire. These are all vampires, right? So a vampire tribal deck would be a deck built around vampires. And often there are cards in tribal decks that will reward you for playing one specific type of creature. So for example, this card, if you control a vampire, you get an extra benefit. If we pop over to... There's... looking for a good example here. There's a whole bunch of them that'll say, like, for all vampires you control, do this thing, right? And those all basically help you out. Oh, here we go. Here's a perfect example. Bishop of the Bloodstained. Target opponent loses 1 life for each vampire you control. So there you are basically being rewarded for playing a whole bunch of vampires. And tribal decks will basically focus around one sort of type of creature. In this case, it would be vampires, but other common ones are merfolk, knights, soldiers. The possibilities are endless. Honestly, tribal decks are probably my favorite type of deck overall. So we'll be seeing a lot of those over the coming days. Spells, when I say spells, if you missed the first video that I did, the very basics introduction, spells are basically every card that isn't a land. Pretty straightforward. There are also tricks. Tricks are just basically instant spells that affect combat, things that you can play to kind of surprise your opponent in the middle of combat. That would be stuff like Sure... That is not how you spell sure, self. Stuff like Sure Strike, right? So your opponent attacks, or you attack, and they declare blockers, and then suddenly you play Sure Strike, and suddenly your creature is much tougher and has First Strike. It's a trick. It's a surprise, something you pull out to surprise your opponent and make them go, oh no. That's a trick, basically. Splashing. Let's talk about splashing. So splashing is a deck building term. You might hear someone say, it is a it's an is it deck splashing black. Like this deck right here, I think is actually an is it deck that doesn't even splash black. It's got Discovery Dispersal in it, which is why it shows there. What would be a good example of a splash deck? Honestly, this double first strike Knights deck is a pretty good example. So in here, this is a mono white. It's mostly a white deck, but it splashes black. There's a little bit of black in it, basically for this one card. I need to remake the mana base for this because I made some changes but didn't retweak the base. But basically the black is in here pretty much for Knight of Malice and Knight of Malice only. And then Golden Demise in the sideboard. So when you hear about somebody splashing a color, it means they're adding just a little bit of it into the one deck, usually for just one or maybe two cards. That's what splashing is. Mana curve is another deck building terminology. If we look in here, you can see there's kind of this curve for your cost of mana. And basically the idea is you don't want to have all of the creatures in your deck be super expensive because you'll die before you even have a chance to play them. So generally you want to have this kind of nice curve where you have more 2 and 3 cost creatures than everything else. Because your one cost creatures are generally fairly weak. They're not going to be game changers or anything like that. They can't really hold down the fort too much. So generally you want to have something kind of like this, where you've got more 2 and 3 drop creatures, more 2 and 3 cost creatures than you do, 7 cost creatures. Because if you have 15 7 cost creatures in your hand, in your deck, that's just way too much. Yeah, they're powerful, but you'll never get a chance to actually play them because you won't be doing anything for the first 7 turns of the game. So mana curve is this idea that you want to have this kind of balance and this kind of nice curve where you've got more 2 and 3 and 4 cost stuff than, big high end or super, super low end. And that'll be a little bit, that curve will end up being a little bit different depending on the type of deck that you want to play. So let's talk about card advantage and virtual card advantage. Card advantage is basically a numbers game. It is how many cards you have access to compared to your opponent, and that's in your hand and on the battlefield. So say you have 4 cards in your hand, and they have 3, and neither of you have anything on the battlefield. You have card advantage, because you have 4 cards to their 3. If, for example, you have 2 cards in your hand and nothing on the field, and they have no cards in their hand, but 7 things on the field, they have card advantage because they have 7 things to your 2 things. Hopefully that makes sense. There are ways to generate card advantage. You can get card advantage by either getting rid of your opponent's cards or by getting more cards. So blue, for example, generally generates card advantage by drawing more cards, right? They say, I'm going to play 1 card to draw 2 cards, and that increases my card advantage by 1. Or they may say, I'm going to play something like this Wizard's Retort. I'm going to counter your spell. And that means I trade one of my cards for one of your cards. Doesn't really generate any card advantage. But if you can get 2 things for their 1 thing, or 3 things for your 1 thing, then you might be generating a lot of card advantage. Board wipes are generally very, very good at this. Things like Cleansing Nova right here. Destroy everything for 1 card. So if they have 8 creatures on the board and you play Cleansing Nova and destroy everything on the board, suddenly you've gotten 8 things for this 1 card. It can generate a lot of card advantage. And that's something you will often hear kind of thrown around. Virtual card advantage, on the other hand, is not about the quantity of the cards. Rather, it is about the quality of the cards. So, for example, say I am holding a Cleansing Nova and a Cleansing Nova and a Zetalpa in my hand. I have 2 cards in my hand and nothing on the board. my opponent has 7 things on the board and a basic land in his hand. I would have virtual card advantage because I have much higher quality cards than my opponent. I can play my Cleansing Nova and destroy his entire board, and then I can play Zatalpa and basically just slowly wait for him to die. That's virtual card advantage. So regular card advantage is about quantity, virtual card advantage is about quality. So next, let's talk about drops. You'll often hear people say 1 drop or 2 drop or 3 drop. That is talking about the converted mana cost of a card. The converted mana cost is basically the total mana cost. So this Ajani's Pridemate, for example, would be a 2 drop because it costs a total of 2 mana, 1 white and 1 of any color. This Repeating Barrage would be a 3 drop because it is 2 red and 1 of any color. This Gutter Snipe would be a 3 drop because it is 2 of any color and 1 red for a total of 3. And so on and so forth. So if you hear someone say, I have a 5 drop or a 7 drop, or I need more 3 drops in this deck, or whatever, they're talking about the converted mana cost. I think as far as terminology goes, that's everything that comes to mind. I'm sure I missed something. There are some things that I intentionally omitted because I didn't want this video to be 5 years long, but I'm sure I also missed some important stuff, so if you have any specific questions, or if you have additions, please do leave them in the comments below. I am only human after all, and, you know, there's a lot of terminology. With 25 years of Magic the Gathering being out there, there's a whole lot of terminology that exists. So it's hard to come up with a completely comprehensive list, but if you have any questions, or as I said, if you have additions you'd like to see added, just leave them in the comments down below, and we'll go from there. But anyway, guys, I think that is going to do it for this episode. Next, we will cover abilities, specific abilities on cards and what they mean, everything that is currently in standard as of the time of that recording. But anyway, my friends, if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. Links in the description below, so check those out as well. Otherwise, my friends, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.